All right, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. So, already giving away what the topic is tonight, but it's something that I'm very, very excited about. We're coming up to Pesach, to Passover. We're going to be telling over the story of the Exodus, of leaving Egypt, and we really have a mitzvah, commandment, to talk about the Exodus every day, to mention it. But additionally to that, we have a special Seder night. We have Passover night, where we are to not just mention it, but to tell over the story and to almost reenact it, to try to re-experience it. And what we understand, what's quite clear, is that the events of the Exodus are foundational pillars of our faith. We witnessed these miracles. We witnessed the 10 plagues. We witnessed God showing his omnipotence, his control, his ability, that he distinguishes, that he's involved in the world. And we pass that on each year to our children, to the next generation, and to each other. Even a person having a Seder on their own is supposed to, the Talmud says explicitly, is supposed to still just talk about it and inculcate the ideas that are so central to our faith. But we have, sometimes a bit of we have to make it fun for the kids, right? So we have like different activities that we do, and pictures of the 10 plagues. And we kind of have this image in our minds, I think, that like the 10 plagues is like this like fun thing, with like frogs and different things. And you have these like caricatures of like Pharaoh like running around. But in fact, if this is a foundation of our faith, it means that these weren't just, it's not just a joke, this is a real thing. And it means also that the plagues aren't just random events. God could do anything. He was like, what do I feel like doing today? Maybe we'll bring some frogs. Like, okay, today, what is it? I'm in the mood for a little boils, right? That they're not just random plagues. That God, there must be something deeper. There must be more meaning to the series of plagues. So we've discussed some of these ideas. We discussed a little bit last year when we talked about Pesach, different ways to understand the series of the plagues and what messages they hold, what they're meant to teach us. But this course is what happened at Sinai, and this is the course where we talk about the Sinai events, not the Exodus. When we talk about the 10 commandments, not the 10 plagues. But in fact, there is a tradition that the 10 plagues actually have very much to do with the 10 commandments. And the idea, the way it's presented by some, is we have a series of 10s. I was trying to think of like another random 10, but we have a series of 10s. We know 10 commandments, we know 10 plagues. We also have an idea in our sages, in the teachings of the Mishnah, that God created the world with 10 statements. If you look in Genesis, you look at Bereshis, the creation of the world, you'll find 9 statements, but the Talmud teaches that the 10th, you'll find 9 times where it says, and God said. So you'll find 9 statements of God. And then the final, the 10th, is actually the first, which is just the word Bereshis, in the beginning, bringing existence into being, into existence. So there's 10 statements to create the world. There's 10 plagues in Egypt, and there are 10 commandments. And could say, very nice, like what do they have to do with each other? Nothing. They just happen to all be 10. But we have a teaching really from some of the Hasidic masters that actually the 10 all have very much to do with each other. And we've talked about in some of my classes in the past, the relationship between the 10 plagues and the 10 statements. What we basically have explained is that Moses comes to Pharaoh and he says, God says, let the people go. And Pharaoh says, who is this Hashem? Who is this God? And Pharaoh denies the existence of God. and he denies the creator of the world. And so he didn't. So the connection that we've learned about in the past is that the plagues had to teach Pharaoh and the Egyptians this lesson that God did in fact create the world. And each of the plagues had a lesson about each of those 10 statements. That was one way that we've approached it. Tonight we're going to approach it a little bit differently, and that is that with a similar idea, but that there was a central lesson in each of the 10 statements of creation, and that was a lesson that the Pharaoh and the Egyptians denied, and the plagues were to teach them a lesson, and us in turn, because we were influenced very much by Egyptian culture in Egypt, and they were a preparation to be able to go and to receive the 10 commandments at Sinai. So each of the 10 plagues teaches a lesson that prepares us for each of the 10 commandments. And those lessons are also should be found also in the 10 statements of creation. So what we're going to do tonight is go through the 10 plagues. We're going to compare them to the 10 commandments. And when appropriate, we'll also tie it into the 10 statements and see if there's a relationship there as well. What I'm going to share with you tonight comes from an essay that I found online from a periodical. It's like a 42 pages in Hebrew, written by a Rabbi Uri Amar. I don't know who Rabbi Uri Amar is. I Googled him to try to find out a little bit. I couldn't find much. It seems he teaches in a yeshiva in Israel, but I thought he did a fantastic job of looking into this, examining it, and coming out with really quality interpretations of how the plagues relate to the 10 commandments. The idea that they relate is something that already exists in writings of Hasidic masters of a couple hundred years ago, from the Ger Hasidus, the Sfas Emes, the Chidushei Arim, some of the Hasidic masters from Ger, but they don't explain it. They just say, like, the 10 plagues teach about the 10 commandments, prepare us for the 10 commandments, but there's no explanation. So in this essay, Rabbi Uri Amar, he goes through each one, and I thought that he really comes up with really fantastic stuff. Again, some of them will be more compelling. Some of them will be more clear to us. Some of them a little bit more vague, maybe a little bit more deep. But we'll do our best. We have 10 shots to try to get some clarity. We'll see how many of them we walk away with a clear picture. So let's get rolling with this. And I'm gonna bring up the slides, and we'll go from there. So here we go. All right. So this is the pre-Pesach, the 10 plagues and the 10 commandments. So here's just a chart. This is what I dropped into the chat. I can drop it in again for anyone who joined after. Let me just drop it in one more time if anybody wants it. So just a chart that shows the 10 statements, the 10 plagues, and the 10 commandments. We're going to go through them one by one. So plague number 1, blood. So all the Nile River turns to blood. There's no drinking water. The fish die. And this is going to somehow relate to the first of the 10 commandments, which is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem, your God. I am the Lord, your God. So what is the connection between these two ideas? So the idea, as I mentioned, the way that we're going to approach this is that the plague was meant to expose some kind of error in the Egyptian way of life, in their outlook, in their beliefs, in their actions. And the plague would teach the lesson and try to rectify that, and really prepare the Jewish people to be able to receive the commandment at Sinai that would correspond to that. So we know this one is actually somewhat the most obvious, I think, of all of them possibly, which is that that the Nile River was the source of sustenance for the Egyptians, and still maybe, to this day, although now there's other options, but it was their source of drinking water. It was what they used to irrigate their fields, which provided all their food. It's where they bathed. It's where they went to cool off from the hot Egyptian sun. It's where they went to get their fish that they ate. The Nile was everything to them. This is what sustained them. This is what gave them life. And they were so dependent on the Nile to the point that they considered the Nile to be a god of theirs, their sustainer, that which gives them life. This is actually mentioned by Rashi from the Midrash, which I quote here, that when God tells Moshe that he's going to turn the river to blood, so Rashi explains, because rain does not fall in Egypt, but the Nile rises and irrigates the land, and the Egyptians on this account worship the Nile. He mentioned specifically that it was what provided irrigation for them, but the Egyptians worshiped the Nile. So therefore, God first smote their deity and afterwards smote them. He first went after their God. He first went after the Nile River, which was their God. But really, they forgot who created the Nile River, who provided that to them, and they looked at the river itself as their sustainer. And by turning the river to blood, God taught that no, this is not a source of life. In fact, it could be full of blood. It could be a source of death if God wants, right? And all the fish die. So it's in that way it becomes a source of death. So God teaches the lesson: the Nile is not your sustainer. The Nile is not what gives life to you. The one who gives life to you is God. Everything that exists, everything that sustains, the very existence of the world only exists on the whim of God. And that's actually expressed also in the first statement of creation. The first statement, Bereshis, in the beginning, where God wills the world into existence. Really, that's, you want to know what sustains the world? It's Bereshis. It's that God had the will, and still does, for the world to exist. And if that will would go away, poof, everything would immediately cease to exist, just like snuff out, and there would be nothing. And so everything that exists it just because God sustains it. And that is the lesson. We talked about this when we learned about the first commandment of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, to believe in God, but to understand, not just to believe in a concept of God, but to understand the Jewish concept of God, which is sophisticated. It's something that we can learn about. We did learn about it. And one of the central and important ideas is that we believe that God is the source of everything and continues to be the source of everything, sustains the whole world constantly. And as I mentioned, it could disappear on a whim. So that was the first lesson. The first plague was to teach them, this is not what sustains you. It's not the Nile River. It's the one who created the Nile River. It is Hashem. It is the God of the world who sustains you. That was number one. Number two was the plague of frogs. And that corresponds to the second commandment, which is do not have any other gods, do not worship idols, etc. So here, while the Egyptians may have believed that the Nile was that which sustained them, that's what they worshipped as their sustainer, but they had plenty of other idols and deities, and they had something for everything, right? So they had a god of love, and a god of war, and a god of reproduction, and a god of this and god of that, and everything had its own deity. This plague of frogs was meant to expose the fallacy, the error in that outlook. And that's why we look at the verse. It says, this is when the plague is being when God is telling what's going to happen, it says, the river shall swarm with frogs, which shall go up and come into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the house of your servants and on your people and into your ovens and into your kneading troughs. Basically, these frogs were going to go everywhere, all over, and they would croak, right? And that was half of the pain and suffering from the plague was just the sound of the frogs. And the idea was that in every little niche, the Egyptians had another god, another idol, another deity. And God sends frogs into all of those. There's actually a historian named Yehuda, an Israeli historian, who said that one of the deities was the deity of reproduction was like a half frog, half woman, an Egyptian idol. And so he suggests that there's a connection there between the frogs. But whatever it may be, the frogs went everywhere and they croaked and they made noise and they invaded the very, the recesses of Egyptian life. And with that invasion, they announced, there's no God here. There's no idols here. This is false. There's falsehood here. There's falsehood here. All of these beliefs, all of these little nooks and crannies are all false. And that corresponds to this prohibition number 2, the second commandment of the 10 commandments. Do not have any other gods. Do not worship other idols and other deities. So, and this commandment focuses on the idea, which again we talked about when we learned about it, that there's no other powers besides for God. God doesn't assign power to other deities and say, okay, go ahead, it's all yours. God continues to control and guide all powers within the world. That's why God is called Elohim in the plural, because all powers that exist are all source themselves back to God, and God controls all of them. But the Egyptians had this idea that there's a God of this and a God of that, and different deities controlling all things. The frogs go in, they invade every section of Egyptian life, and they announce and they croak and they say, no, this is falsehood here, this is falsehood here. And so the first plague of blood focused more on what the Egyptians were missing. They didn't believe in God as creator of the world, as sustainer, and they and rather they believed that the Nile was their sustainer. So to that corresponds the positive commandment to believe in Hashem. I am the Lord your God. And then the second plague really exposes their error in believing in all of these different deities, this whole array of Hall of Fame full of different kinds of gods, and this manifests itself in a negative commandment of do not have any other gods, not worship those other gods. So that's number 1 and number 2. Now that we've sort of established the central theology necessary, recognize that there's Hashem, the God of the world, don't believe in any other idols. So the next step is to know what's our place in the world. How does a human, fit into all of this? So the next plague, number 3, is the plague of lice. And commandment, the third of the 10 commandments, is do not take God's name in vain. So it's very interesting, actually, this plague of lice. And I've been thinking about it because it kind of ties into some things going on in the world today. So as I mentioned, at this point, we have to understand where does man fit in? We have to understand man's power and man's place in the world. And a person who knows that there are no other gods, there's no other deities, they can still easily fall into the trap of believing that we are in total control of everything that happens in the world. We as humans can control our destiny completely. And people can forget that God is actually the one running things. We can make decisions, we can put in our effort, but whether those efforts will bear fruit ultimately is determined by God, not by us. And so we come to the third plague. Now it's interesting because the Torah records explicitly that after the plague of blood, the Pharaoh called his necromancers, his sorcerers, and he said, "Can you guys do that?" And the Torah says that they did. They were able to turn water into blood. Don't ask me how you do it. They knew how, right? The second plague, frogs. Can you produce frogs? Pharaoh said to them, "Can you make frogs come out of the river?" The Torah records explicitly that they did the same thing. They were able to bring out frogs. The third plague is lice. Lice was a plague that it spread all over. It came from the earth, and obviously, terribly uncomfortable. These lice biting them all over, and Pharaoh again calls to his sorcerers, and he says, "Can you repeat this plague? Can you do this?" And here the Torah says, and it's in front of us here, verse 14. And the necromancers did likewise with their secret rites, meaning they tried to use their magic to bring out the lice, but they could not. And the lice was upon man and beast. Rashi explains, why could they not? Because a demon has no power over a creature smaller than a barley corn. So the lice were too small for their magic, their demonic magic to work on it. Again, whatever that means exactly, but it was too small for them to affect, and they couldn't do it. And here it says, so therefore they said to Pharaoh, "It is the finger of God." This is the hand of God that's at work. Finally, the first two, they were able to reproduce. They weren't so impressed. This one, they can't reproduce, they can't replicate, and they're tremendously impressed. Pharaoh's not as impressed. Pharaoh hardens his heart. He still won't send out the Jews, but the sorcerers at least are impressed. And the lesson is, up till this point, they still thought that they could do anything. There's nothing we can't do. The power of man in the world, nothing can stop us. We're capable of anything. But here's something that they realized, we can't do this. We're not as powerful as we thought. We are limited, and we have to realize that there's a limit to what we're able to do. This was one major lesson that people took from the current pandemic, from the coronavirus. That you can have a tiniest. The teeniest, tiniest. I was thinking about this and I got distracted by why we say teeniest, tiniest. Why don't we just say teeniest, teeniest, or tiniest, tiniest? It's a very deep question. I'll let you ponder it after the class. But the teeniest, tiniest of whatever it is, viral molecule, right? It started out with one or whatever it started with, right? On one person, one animal, one person. And it brought the entire world to a stop. And we saw, how we thought we were in control of everything. And all of a sudden God says, let's teach you the lesson. You're not in control of everything. But what happens is then after a year, we have so many fantastic researchers working on vaccines. And now we have vaccines coming. And we start to think, we are in control. We just have to get everyone vaccinated. We could control this. And that's falling into the trap again. The point isn't to scare us. I hope that, pray to God that he decides that the vaccine should work and nothing should, there shouldn't be variants that they don't work on, or there shouldn't be new things. But the point is that we have to remember, ultimately, it's not just the vaccines that's our effort. That's what we call in Hebrew, hishtadlut. That's the effort that we put in. But it's God who decides whether that effort will come to fruition. God could say, listen, they're forgetting the lesson. They think they're in control again. I'll send a variant and start it all over again, right? God forbid, right? We pray that doesn't happen, but it's important to remember at this juncture that still it's all in the hands of God. Just like the Egyptians, there was some so small, so tiny that they couldn't control it, they couldn't replicate it. So we should be reminded that ultimately it's all in God's hands. And that was the lesson of this plague, of plague number 3, that of lice, that were limited. They could repeat the first 2 plagues. They weren't able to repeat this. Man's ability is limited. Ultimately, it's God who controls things. This can correspond to the third statement of creation, which was the creation of the firmament, the sky. The third statement is, let there be a firmament to separate between the lower waters and the upper waters, whatever the upper waters means exactly. But the idea is that there's this whole sky above us. And that's how God decided to create the world, with a sky. And what that reminds us is of the distance between us and God, not the physical distance. God isn't in the physical heavens. God exists on a different spiritual plane. But the way the world is created is that we can look up to the heavens. We have this enormous sky, and we can realize that there's a gap between us and God. We are not God. We are not in total control of things. That helps us recognize that distance, that difference between us and our Creator. And that's a very important idea. And that's what's also brought out in the third commandment: do not take God's name in vain. The commandment not to take God's name in vain is specifically in the context of a vow. That it means don't take a vow that's in vain, a pointless vow, with God's name. So some examples would be to take a vow that's about something that everybody knows. You say God's name, it's pointless. Like, everybody knows that that the grass is green. Like, that's a waste. That's making God's name mundane to use God's name in that context. Or the opposite, to vow that the grass in the world is purple. To say something that's not true, that's obviously blatantly not true, is also wasting God's name and using it in vain. Swearing to nullify a mitzvah, so that also is a wasted vow, because you can't do that. We are already obligated. We are already avowed of the mitzvos, of the commandments. We can't vow not to do them. And another one would be to take a vow to do something that's not in our control to do, that we're not actually capable of doing, would be a wasted vow. And all of these ideas, the idea is the person is just throwing out God's name in a casual way. If somebody could just swear by God's name to something that's meaningless, so they've made God's name mundane, they make it casual, they're basically bringing God down to the human plane, and not recognizing the difference and the distance and the gap between the unimaginable gap between what a human being is and what God is. And so that's one important idea that of how this relates, is just recognizing the difference between humans and God, and not casting God's name around casually. But another take it a step further, the idea of a vow in the first place, even if it's not in vain. Let's say, I want to promise to do something, and it's something that I'm capable of doing. I'm not talking about this prohibition. This prohibition is to vow something that you're not capable of. But the idea in the first place of vowing to do something, of promising to do something that you are capable of, is somewhat problematic on its own in light of what we're saying. Because if I promise to do something, if I take a vow, I make a commitment, and it's good to commit to things, but a vow is like a very strong way to do it. So and what I'm essentially saying is that I have the power to make sure that I fulfill this vow. And in that very statement is somewhat of a denial of the idea that I'm not in total control. It's assuming that I'm in total control. If I vow, I will be there on time, and I don't just say it, but I take a vow, I swear, that I'm going to be there on time. Well, do you really think that it's in your control? Like a million things can happen that are out of your control, that God can send you stumbling blocks and things can change. So the very idea of taking a vow in the first place could be somewhat problematic, because it goes against what we're saying here. We're saying now that we need to recognize that we are not in total control of things. That was the lesson of the plague of lice. And so while that's not the specific prohibition of number 3 here, it's specifically here is don't take God's name in vain, but in a certain sense, any vow can turn into a vow that's in vain, because circumstances can change, and something that we thought was in our power may no longer be in our power. And so there's this additional idea here that taking a vow to do something that is not in our control, as if it was, or even something that is in our control, but we think it's in our control, but it may not be. So that also speaks to the same lesson that was brought out in the plague of lice, which was to teach the Egyptians man's place, that man can try, should put in efforts, but not to assume that when it comes down to it, that we're actually the ones who control the outcome. That is all in God's hands. That is number 3. Okay, number 4 was a little bit more complicated, a little less compelling to me. So just for the sake of time, for now, I'm going to skip over it. And if we have time, I'll come back to it. But it was a little less clear to me, so it's not going to come off as well. So let's go straight to number 5. Okay, so plague number 5 was dever, pestilence. It was the farm animals of the Egyptians died in a plague. And this is somehow going to correspond to commandment number 5 of the 10 commandments, which is to honor your father and mother, honor your parents. So the Torah actually describes this it's the first plague that's described as Yad Hashem, the hand of God was upon the animals. And all of the plagues were the hand of God, but there's something different about this one that somehow expresses the hand of God even more. And that perhaps was that this was the first plague that directly took away life. The other plagues, blood, frogs, lice, wild animals, so those plagues all, there could have been people that died as a result of them, but it wasn't directly like the plague is death. This is the first one. The plague is death to the animals. But again, it wasn't death to humans yet. We do see that in the last plague, death to the firstborns, but this was direct death to the animals. And the question is, what's the message in this? And perhaps the message has to do with the human soul. In Kabbalah, there's an idea that the soul is divided into 3 parts. So in general, we call it the neshama, the soul. But even the soul has 3 parts. It has nefesh, which is the lowest part, the ruach, the spirit, and neshama is also used as one of the 3, as the highest and holiest part of the soul as a whole. The lowest part is called the nefesh, and sometimes it's called the nefesh habahamis, the animalistic nefesh, the animalistic soul. That within within ourselves, there's always a struggle between the holiest part of ourselves, the neshama, the highest part of our soul, and the nefesh, the lowest part of the soul of our soul. And the spirit, the ruach in between, that's the struggle, is who's going to rule? Is it going to be the spiritual side of us, the holiest part, or is it going to be the more base and earthly part of us, which is the lower part of our soul, the nefesh. And the goal, the struggle in life is to always try to have the spiritual and the holy part elevate the lower part and control the lower part and the rest of our soul and the rest and our actions. And perhaps the message of this, of taking away the nefesh, the soul, the life of the animals of the Egyptians at this time, was that the Egyptians were so stooped in immorality and idolatry, and they were destroying their souls. They were destroying their own souls. And within each person within each of us and within every human being is the potential to elevate and to sanctify that baser part of ourselves, to channel ourselves towards service of God, to channel ourselves towards holiness and sanctity. We have to latch onto that spiritual path. We have to allow our neshama, the holier part of us, to control our actions. And the Egyptians, who were grounded in immorality and idolatry, they failed to recognize this. They failed to accomplish this. They couldn't elevate their physical, the more base and earthly parts of their souls. And this corresponds to the fifth statement of creation, which was I see now the chart is different than the order that I'm working off now. So the chart's not gonna, we're gonna look at, if you have the chart, what's actually listed as number 4 here, which is the vegetation. Let the earth sprout vegetation, seed yielding herbs. So God says, let trees and let vegetation come forth from the earth. And what's strange though is after that, God, on the third day of creation, he creates the trees and stuff. But then later in the next chapter in Genesis, it says that no tree of the field was yet on the earth, neither did any herb of the field yet grow, because the Lord God had not brought rain upon the earth, and there was no man to work the soil. So God created the trees and the rain and the grass and everything, but then the Torah says, but it hadn't grown yet. So Rashi there explains that when God originally created it, it was on the brink of growing. He created it was about to come out, about to sprout, but it didn't sprout until after man was created. And what that represents is the potential, the earthly potential, right? That you had these plants on the verge of sprouting. That was this statement of creation. The statement of creation, of creating the plants and the vegetation, was to create the potential for the earth to sprout. It didn't sprout till later, but the potential was there. And that's the potential of the earthly part of our neshama. There's the potential there to develop it, to have it be sanctified, but we have to bring out that potential. And that's also what we honor. I should say honor your father and mother. Honor your parents. And we're taught that there's 3 partners in the creation of a human being. There's God, and then there's the mother and the father. The mother and the father give the human being the physical, and God gives us the neshama, the soul. But what our parents really give us ultimately is the potential to sanctify our earthly selves. And that itself is something to honor them for. And whether they are the best parents or whether they're not such great parents at raising us, but just that on its own is already, just on the most basic level, a reason to honor them and to be grateful to them, because they gave us the potential. They gave us the potential to take that physical self and elevate it and sanctify it. And for that alone, we should honor them, besides for whatever else that they've done for us. And so that's the lesson of number 5, is the pestilence which took out the animal souls, was to teach the Egyptians they weren't using they weren't elevating the animal soul within them, the material, the earthly soul. They weren't allowing the more spiritual side to rule over the more physical side. And the fifth commandment, honor your parents, teaches us about the potential that our parents implanting us when they bring us into this world, that potential that on its own is enough to honor them for, they give us the vessel to work with for our soul now to elevate the more earthly parts of us. Number 6 was the plague of boils, and it's going to correspond to the 6th commandment of the 10 commandments, do not murder. So in the plague of boils, the Egyptians, Moses threw ashes throughout Egypt, and wherever it landed, the Egyptians grew boils on their skin. So the Torah teaches us, I thought I put in the, oh, okay, no, right, okay. So this plague was the first plague that hit the bodies of the Egyptians directly, meaning it wasn't the river turning to blood, it wasn't frogs jumping around and then the frogs going after, it wasn't animals coming after them. I guess maybe the lice is also kind of direct, but this plague itself struck at the Egyptians themselves and really destroyed their bodies to some extent. It destroyed their physical makeup and left them with all these boils over their skin. And perhaps the message was to expose the destruction that they were already doing to their physical bodies. The meaning the body is given to us with a mission. It has a purpose. Its purpose is to be the soul's vessel in the world. It's the way that our souls can interact in the world. It's the way that our souls can perform mitzvahs. It's the way that our souls can do good in the world. Without a body, the soul couldn't be in the world. So and here they were not directing, again, they involved in immorality and in idolatry. They were not using their body for the purpose that it was meant for. In a sense, they were destroying their own bodies. That was the message of the plague of boils. And the commandment, do not murder, is really along the same lines. You might say, what's the big deal? Why not murder? Don't we teach, Rabbi, I've been coming to your class. You teach that the body is temporary, the soul is eternal. Like, what's the big deal about taking out someone's body? So their soul will go back to the heavens, and it's the body's temporary anyways. What's wrong with a little murder? It's a fleeting. But no, the soul needs the body. The body is the way that the soul can interact in the world. The soul comes to this world for a reason. It can't develop its relationship with God in a purely spiritual place. It needs a physical world to be tested in, to create that relationship with God. It needs the physical world, and it needs a body. Rav Hirsch, who speaks about the Hebrew language a lot and the meaning behind words. So the word for flesh is basar, and basar, levaser, it also means like to announce or proclaim. Bisurot tovot is good news from the same root, a good proclamation. And he explains that the reason why flesh is called basar is because it's the way that our soul is sort of announced to the world or proclaimed to the world, meaning it expresses the importance. The body expresses the importance of the deep importance of every human being and what lies beneath. It's the herald of the spirit to the world and of the world to their spirit. It's how our spirit, it's how our soul interacts with the world in both directions, how the world interacts with the soul and how the soul interacts with how the world interacts with the soul and how the soul interacts with the world. So that's the job of the body, the very important job. And so the Egyptians were misusing their bodies, chasing after pleasures, chasing after their desires, rather than using it for loftier purposes. God directly sends boils to their bodies, saying, you're destroying your bodies, you're not using them for their purpose. And do not murder speaks to the same thing. Don't destroy the body. The body is so important. It's what our soul uses to interact with the world, to do mitzvos, to perform God's will, and to create that relationship with God. Number 7 is the plague of hail. And along with it is the commandment, the 7th commandment, do not commit adultery. So the Torah describes for us something very fascinating about hail. We think about hail, we think about ice pellets. Sometimes they're very small, sometimes they're a little bit big. But the Torah says that the hail that fell in Egypt was very unique. There was hail and fire flaming within the hail, very heavy, the likes of which had never been throughout the entire land of Egypt since it had become a nation. So first of all, it was very heavy, but also there was fire within the ice, within the hail. Rashi explains this was a miracle within a miracle. The fire and hail intermingled. Although hail is water, ice, but they intermingled to perform the will of their maker. They made peace between themselves, that the hail not extinguish the fire, nor did the fire melt the hail. So miraculous. The hail was fire inside, two things that should really wipe each other out, one or the other. There should be, one of them should win, and yet they intermingled, they joined together. And why? Rashi says, to perform the will of their maker. Now, before we delve into that a little bit more, let's just talk about, there's something unique about this plague, which was a few verses before. So that was verse 24 of chapter 9 that I read. But back in verse 18, the Torah teaches us that the Egyptians were actually given a chance to get out of the way of this plague. Moshe warned them and said, gathering your livestock and all that you have in the field, any man or beast that is found in the field and not brought into the house, the hail shall fall on them and they will die. So they had a chance to go inside, and some did. Some listened and went inside, and some still didn't go inside, which is unbelievable. After 6 plagues, they still didn't get the message. They had a warning, a chance to go inside, and they didn't listen. But what's the message to telling the Egyptians to go inside? What was the deeper message? So perhaps the message was a message of modesty. Not everything has to be out in the open. Not everything is appropriate to be done in public. Not everyone should be gathering together. Certain places are inappropriate to be. Certain social situations are inappropriate. The Egyptians, we're going to learn about it when we get, I don't know if we're going to talk about it actually, but the Torah talks about it in the plague of the firstborn. So it says that there wasn't a single house where somebody didn't die. Now, what about, couldn't there be a house where it was only the firstborn sons that died? So couldn't there be a house where the firstborn was a girl? Right? How could it be that there was no house with no firstborn? So one interpretation is it just means that whoever was the oldest died. It didn't have to actually be the firstborn. Rashi says that as a first suggestion. Second suggestion, Rashi says, quotes a midrash, that the reason why there was a firstborn in every Egyptian house was because the Egyptians were so immoral that the women would sleep with all different men, and they would have children from from many different men. And it was the firstborn of every union that died. So there were lots more firstborns than you might have thought in a normal society. That's how immoral their society was. And so the message here was like, rein it in. Okay, there's things that are appropriate and there are things that are inappropriate. That's obviously a very extreme expression of impropriety, of something that's absolutely immoral. But the message was, come inside. Not everything that happens outside should be happening. And simultaneously with that message is the message of what makes an appropriate union. What is appropriate? And what's appropriate is that sometimes you have two different types. You have fire and you have hail, but they can come together to perform the will of their maker. And if they're coming together to perform the will of their maker, then that is sustainable. And the idea is that, we live in a world of imperfection. God created a world of imperfections so that we have a chance to grow and to perfect ourselves and to earn our reward in our relationship with him. And it's done through partnerships. It's done through partnerships of husband and wife, but also through social partnerships and through, gatherings like this. Nobody can do it alone. We do it together. We work on our imperfections together. And in a sense that the idea is to try to bring people should try to come together, obviously not for immoral things, but specifically the opposite, for growing and for helping each other perfect themselves. And that's what a marriage is also supposed to be: two people coming together to fulfill God's will. And this plague really teaches us that two opposites could come together in that manner. And therefore this plague, which teaches us this lesson, corresponds to number 7 of the 10 Commandments, which is do not commit adultery. Adultery reveals that the bond, the marriage that is being violated here, was not being built on holiness, on sanctity, on growth, on a desire to do the will of God, but rather it was something that was very much focused just on personal desire and pleasure. And that's why someone was not happy with the relationship and went for a different physical relationship, right? I understand sometimes people aren't happy with the relationship. That can happen. But for someone to go and look for a physical relationship somewhere else, so that's an expression of they are seeking pleasure. That's what they're looking for in the marriage. But if a marriage is based on a desire to perfect each other and bring sanctity to the world, so then the shared goals will hopefully help, in keeping those people together and not have them go looking elsewhere. So that successful marriage is actually expressed in the hail and in the fire and the ice coexisting when they're together to perform God's will. There's a teaching of the Talmud that the word ish and isha, it'd be easier if I had it out here on the screen, but the word ish and isha. So the word ish is aleph yud shin, and the word isha is aleph shin hey, and the difference in letters of those two words, the word ish, man, ish is man. It has a yud, which the word isha for woman doesn't have, and the word isha for woman has a hey, which the word man doesn't have. And yud and hey make up God's name. And so if God is part of the equation, then you have ish and isha. Then you have a couple. But if you take out those two letters, then you have aish and aish. You just have fire. You just have fighting. So when you share when you have a shared mission bring sanctity, to try to fulfill, our purpose. So then you'll have ish and isha, you'll have man and his wife. Okay, continuing on, number 8 is the plague of locusts and the commandment, do not steal. So here the Torah tells us that with the plague of locusts, the locusts basically came and devoured anything that was left. Not everything was destroyed in the hail. Depends on how brittle or how flexible the plants were. Some of them were able to survive the hail. Whatever was left, the locusts came and devoured. And not only that, but the Torah says they will obscure the view of the earth. No one will be able to see the earth. So they covered the whole earth, and they will eat the surviving remnant which remains from you from the hail. Whatever was left, they ate. And this exposed a mistaken belief of the Egyptians in terms of material possessions and what is ours in the world and what rights do we have to the land and to the possessions of others. The Egyptians believed that the land was theirs. They didn't recognize that the world belongs to God. God grants it to people. God grants it to people, but it's sort of borrowed, and we have to work within the boundaries set out by God. The Egyptians had the mentality that might wins. Whoever's stronger can take the other person's property, and but the Torah says otherwise. The Torah says, "Ki li kol haaretz." God says, "The land belongs to me, and I grant you the ability to use it, but not to take it against my will." And the locusts were to expose that. They covered the whole earth. They said, "This earth doesn't belong to you. This earth belongs to God." And that is the lesson also, obviously, of do not steal, lo tignov, which, according to some interpretations, speaks about kidnapping, but also on a most basic level speaks about possession, stealing, and the recognition that what people have is theirs as because God deemed it that it should be theirs, and we don't have a right to just take something away from someone else because we desire it more. That denies the validity of someone else's ownership and thereby denies the underlying ownership of God as the grantor of everything in the world. Number 9, the plague of darkness. Try to wrap up. We're already at 9 o'clock, so I'll try to just go through these last ones quickly. The plague of darkness exposed the fact that everything in Egypt was false. It was smoking mirrors. The Egyptians, they tried to present an image of them that was just a false image. The sorcerers wanted people to believe that their power was limitless. Pharaoh wanted people to think that he was a god. The Egyptians had such a focus on materialism and wealth, and that was what mattered to them. They didn't have morals. They didn't have spirituality. The physical desires are what ruled. And the plague of darkness showed that it's all one big lie. Everything looks shiny and beautiful, about Egypt was now dark. This is a dark place. This is a place that's fake, and that has no true essence to it. And that is the lesson also of not testifying falsely. In general, we have a commandment, don't lie, right? It's not in the 10 commandments, but the Torah tells us to stay away from falsehood in general. But the commandment here focuses on testifying falsely because this is the most extreme example of sheker, of falsehood. Because when a person testifies falsely in court, it's a whole different level. What happens is there's really 2 problems with saying something false. One is that you there's a truth that you are covering up. But besides that, you're covering what's actually true. You're also creating a new reality. You're creating a new reality that's false. And that new reality is most expressed in the case of a court case, where if somebody testifies falsely, can actually be like ruled, stamped and and made official that this is the new reality if that testimony is accepted. You have a litigant who's listening to this and he can't do anything about it. He knows that the witnesses are lying, but there's nothing he could do. It becomes the new reality. It becomes the falsehood becomes reality. And the plague of darkness was meant to expose the falsehoods of Egypt, the things that they thought were real and were important, or that they made on as if they were real. And darkness said, no, we're going to cover it with, God says, I'm covering it with darkness. This is all dark. This is all falsehood over here. And finally, the death of the firstborn. The death of the firstborn strikes at the lives of the Egyptians themselves. And this one basically says, your lives, the Egyptians that lost their lives and whose lives were taken in this plague, God says, finally, these lives are worthless to me. They are not deserving of life anymore. And that's the ultimate statement, really, of depravity and emptiness in the land. And the firstborns were the ones who took the hit. They were the leaders of the families. They were the respected ones, and they served as an example for everyone else. And this corresponds to the commandment, do not covet. When a person, the Torah doesn't say don't desire other things. It's good not to be so desirous of things, but that's not the commandment here. The commandment here is don't want what your neighbor has. Don't want what your friend has. Because if you want his car and you want his house and you want his wife, basically you want to be him. That's what coveting expresses. It's a desire. It's an expression of, I'm not happy being me. I want to be someone else. My life is of no value to me. I want to live a different life than I live. But in fact, God puts us into a position in the world where we're supposed to be, within our boundaries, gives us the tools that we need to succeed. And we don't need someone else's life. We need to just appreciate the value that each of us has and brings to the world. So do not covet says, the lives of the Egyptians had reached a point where God said they're of no value. Do not covet says, recognize the value that exists within each of you. Don't covet someone else's life. Don't try to be someone else. Be who you are. Appreciate the value that's in each one of you. So those are the 10 and 10. Well, we did 9, we skipped 1, but that's 9 out of 10 of the 10 commandments and the 10 plagues, how they relate. And again, the idea was that the Egyptians, in denying the Egyptians in failing to recognize these essential lessons, living a life that denied all of these important ideas, God exposes them throughout the 10 plagues, exposes these errors, these erroneous perspectives, outlooks, and that's a preparation to be able to receive the 10 commandments at Sinai just a few months later. And with the great revelation, we learned the lessons, and then we're ready to receive the 10 commandments. All right, we will. Out there.
Thank you, Rabbi.